was delighted that Michael was willing to share some of his thoughts and his work with us. Um, I'll just say, I mean, I've been following Michael's work for a long time. Uh, Michael's work that I've really engaged in some depth goes back to his co-authored papers with Kurt Fisher and is it really really important, really seminal stuff actually. And so I really think of Michael as being a really kind of towering figure in the developmental psychological space. And so I've really appreciated that element of his work. I've also through Greg's consilience conferences, I've appreciated Michael's engagement with those and got to see a different side of his work. And so there's all that kind of background developmental psychology contributions, but of course, Michael also has done really wonderful work in the non kind of profit sphere. And maybe if you want to say a little bit about that, I want is it what is it bringing people together? What's the name of the organization?
Common Ground
Uh,
Institute.
Say again.
Common Ground
Common
Institute.
Ground Institute, right? Yeah, in terms of trying to bring people together across all sorts of differences and facilitate connection in that way. And then on top of all that, being I think a thinker who is engaging in the big picture discussion and is interested and has a lot of insights that can help us think and develop our integrative metatheoretical work by kind of challenging our presuppositions around individuality or the objective and the subjective. And I know that that's what you're going to be presenting on today. And doing also with a wonderful demeanor of humility and humor, which I highly enjoy as well. So that's all set you up. And feel free to say anything else about your background and your work that I didn't hit on there. But I'm really delighted and appreciate you willing to share today.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Can you hear me well? Yeah, good. Um, one of the things I so value about what you are doing in this process is looking at big picture questions and the whole idea of the crisis of meaning. I think that that is so right on, and that's the place we need to really look at some way. How do we bring people together in order to come up with shared values, shared meanings, but that are not axiomatic or dogmatic, that continue to evolve over time. All right, I'm going to share my slides. Here we go. Neither objective nor subjective, an intersubjective epistemology for social science. We're still haunted by Descartes' ghosts, especially in psychology. Psychology, we got a person. We're supposed to be studying individuals, supposed to be studying persons. And then what we do is, of course, we divide the person up into a mind and a body. And psychology has properly rejected the idea of an incorporeal mind, in my opinion, anyway. However, it still retains all the basic Cartesian distinctions, including inner outer, there's an inside and an outside. Subjective objective, there's a subjective inside and an objective outer. Thought and behavior, thought is inside, behavior is outside. You've got the mind controls the body. And of course, you've got all the problems that are associated with the mind body problem, which are, in my opinion, intractable and suggest that this distinction cannot live. And my problem is not so much with mind and body as with these distinctions and what I want to talk about today, the subjective versus the objective distinction. So even though psychology gets rid of an incorporeal mind, it retains all these other distinctions. And in so doing, however, it privileges, because it wants to be a science, the exterior over the interior, the objective over the subjective. It methodologically privileges one pole over the other, even though it retains both sides of that pole, implicitly, if not explicitly. And what do? We vacillate back and forth. We vacillate back and forth between the two poles. So, on the one hand, we say we're a science, and if we're a science, we have to engage in objective observation. We have to focus on the outer. We have to focus on publicly available behavior, which is objective. But then there are other people who say, well, you can't do that. So we got to have introspection. We have to have phenomenological psychology. We have to introspect. We have to get inside of the intersubjective states of people. We'll use all types of qualitative methods, and the distinction lies along a qualitative, quantitative dimension as well. Um, so we have this distinction between inner and outer. And if we are truthful with ourselves, at least those of us who are those in psychology who uh, embrace the objective ideal, if we're truthful, I suspect that what people do when they engage in the objective ideal, when they're trying to get at at objective behavior, is that they imagine what's going on inside the person, and they consult their own experience in some way, and that is what informs their understanding of that which is objective. And so the objective ideal is impossible. I'm going to be arguing soon. So we vacillate back and forth, and we do not have an integrated way of resolving this distinction in science and social science in general. So even though we vacillate back and forth between mind and body, and inner, the outer, the introspective, and the objective observation, we solve this problem, at least in psychology, in a very curious way. We ask ourselves, since we're a science, can I identify objective indicators of subjective experience? I can't get into your mind. I can't get into your experience. The Americanism that we hear all the time, if you will, is, hey, you can't get into my mind. You can't tell me what my experience is. Only I can tell you what my experience is. So the psychologist says, well, okay, if that's true, if the experience is inside of you, I can only do my science if I can identify objective, publicly observable indicators of something that is subjective. That's how we try to solve this vacillation, what I'm going to call this vacillation problem. Now, there's the experience, and we have to somehow get into, there's a gap in our minds between the subjective experience and the objective exterior. It's a mystery to us. We have to figure it out somehow. But the best we can do to figure it out is introspection, is what we ordinarily tell ourselves. Now, here's an example of how we try to get objective indicators of subjective experience. Ekman's classic work with emotional facial expressions. Well, we tend to think that the emotional facial expression is the behavioral, the objective indicator of the internal emotion, is the objective indicator of the subjective state. But then that raises a question for the traditional psychologist. How do we know? How do we know? How do we know that fear, that face is the expression of fear? Well, we're back to introspection again. Or we'll ask people, hey, what is that face fear? What are you feeling when you look at that face, or some such thing? And then the person introspects, gives us a self-report. And but we just said that the self-report was subjective. Well, how are we doing this? How is this possible? So, why this doesn't work? Why this vacillation? Why this juxtaposition of the internal and the external, the subjective and the objective, doesn't work, in my opinion? Well, there's two reasons. Because A, subjectivity fails, and B, objectivity fails. Both fail. I'm going to give you the punchline now. The punchline is this: we do not gain psychological knowledge, I suggest, either through subjective experience or through objective observation. Both fail. Instead, what we call subjective, which I don't want to call subjective, and what we call objective, which I don't want to call objective, both have their origins in a prior intersubjectivity. Both have their origins in a prior interexperientiality, would be the better term, but it's got too many syllables. And that's what I want to show you. And and I'm going to show about why I think subjectivity fails and why I think objectivity fails, and then we'll come up with a third possibility. I don't know what y'all know about Wittgenstein and the private language argument. I'm going to talk about that now. It's a tough one. It's a hard one. If people who haven't been exposed to it, it's very hard to get yourself into. And people who have exposed to it, it's probably boring to listen to it again. But I'm going to go through it. Please forgive me. Why subjectivity fails as a source of psychological knowledge. Go back to Ekman. If subjective events, the experience of fear, are private, we think of subjectivity typically as something that is private, that only I have access to. It is hidden from view. If subjective events are private and objective events are public, then we can't identify objective indicators of subjective events unless we already have a way of accessing the subjective event, which means that the subjective events weren't private in the first place. Because if they were private, we wouldn't be able to measure them. We wouldn't be able to see a connection between the objective and the subjective. So the subjective, what we call the subjective, must in some way be available to us in some way already. But because the subjective, what we call the subjective, is, we think, not objective, that violates our conception of what science ought to look like. And then we get afraid and we retreat back into objectivity as an ideology. So I believe this. We gain psychological knowledge neither through objective observation nor through objective introspection, but instead through, I'm going to come to say, intersubjective engagement. That's the source of psychological and social knowledge, not objectivity. Now, how do you get to this? Let's start with our everyday assumptions. We tend to believe on the street that our experience is inner and private. You can't know my experience. How dare you? Only I can know my experience. I have privileged access to my experience. You can't. I know my experience through introspection. You don't have access to my private experience. These are everyday assumptions. Here's Wittgenstein's argument against the possibility of private language. What Wittgenstein was interested in is in the question of how do our psychological words get their meaning? How do the words that we use to describe our internal states, like emotions, experiences, where do they get their meaning? Now, of course, the everyday answer is, well, they get their meaning from the experience, of course, that the word points to the experience. This is the introspective argument. Wittgenstein refutes this. He says, imagine everybody had an object. He says that if experience were private, it would be as if everybody had a box into which they put an object, call the object a beetle. And inside of that box, they could only see in that box. Only they could see in that box, and nobody else could ever see in the box. So, oh, there we go. Here's everybody. Everybody has their own private box into which they have an object that they call the beetle. Where does the meaning of the word beetle come from? How do we know what's in anybody's box? The answer is we can't. Without some sort of public criteria to define the concept of beetle, no one could ever know what the word means. No one could ever know what the word refers to. Where do we get this notion? How do we know? So I can call it a beetle. You can call whatever's in your box a beetle, but never the twain shall meet unless we can have some common basis for understanding what's in each other's boxes. This is the private language argument. And obviously we name our emotions. We name our experiences. Is that just an illusion? Or are we doing something real when we're doing that? Well, we do label our private experience. Now, what does this mean? This must mean that our experience cannot be necessarily or a priori private. We must be relying on something to identify our experiences socially, because words represent social meanings. If we say anger and you know what I mean and I know what I mean, we share that. We have to, then the experience cannot be private or fully private because we have some basis for identifying the word. So This is what it would be like if we didn't. Again, the beetle in the box. Imagine everybody has an experience, call it blanger. And each person is the only one who would ever see their experience of blanger. No one would be able to verify the meaning of the word. So I look inside myself, I'm introspecting, I say I feel blangry, and you look inside yourself and you introspecting, I feel blangry. How can we possibly understand the meaning of the term blangry? We can't. We can't because we have no common reference point. Without public criteria to identify blanger, no one could know what the word refers to. So experience cannot always or a priori or necessarily be private. If public expressions provide the criteria needed to identify inner experiences, then inner states cannot be said to be private. This is what Wittgenstein comes up with. The ordinary idea that we have an external expression and an internal experience, and because of our commitment to objectivity, we pretend that the internal experience is somehow mysterious or inaccessible. We can't talk about it unless we have an objective connection. That's wrong, he's saying. He's saying this, that the inner and the outer are flip sides of the same process. There's not a mystery about why the facial expression that we call joy maps onto an inner state, quote unquote, that we call joy, because they are the same process. They are the same thing. One is simply the public manifestation of a personal process. Expressions are public manifestations of our experiential states. I shouldn't say inner states. There is not first an internal state and then also an expression. No, the expression is a manifestation of the ongoing inner state, the ongoing activity. There's not two things, there's one with two sides of it. If this is true, our experiences are not a priori hidden. It is true, indeed, that we can hide our states, if you will, but that is a developmental achievement. And not only is that a developmental achievement, when we hide our internal states, we do not hide our internal states. We hide our external expressions. We hide our external expressions, not the internal. So we hide the vehicle to the internal, if you will, to the experiential, I should say. So what we've got here is the inside, the quote unquote inside of the outside, already connected together. Without the public expression, we can't gain access to another person's experiential state. So, same thing. So, here's the process. There's the expression. Here's how internal state words get their meaning, not by introspection, but through a social relational complex process. We experience our experiences, our emotions directly. But that does not mean that we are able to represent them or make them intelligible directly. That's a secondary process. So we got an experience, an expression. There's the expression. Other people look at that expression. This is Wittgenstein's theory of where our internal state language comes from, how we're able to represent our own psychological processes. So other people look in the community, look at the expression. They say, hey, what should we call that? Well, they don't say that, but you get my point. What should we call that? Hey, let's call it anger. That's anger. So the expression is there. The people in the community see the expression. That's the public criteria that we use to define that expression, that experience. We give it a word. And then once we give it a word, we have a word in our community. That word exists, look here, between us in our shared space, in our shared intersubjective community, in culture. Then what happens? Here's a baby. Here's a 1-year-old. The 1-year-old shows that expression. The father, the mother, the caregiver says, oh, are you feeling angry? There's the word. Are you feeling angry? How does the baby, the child, come to represent and make his or her own experience intelligible? Well, that person, in a secondary act of reflection, takes the meaning of the word anger in the community and applies it to the self in an act of reflection, in a social act of reflection. So the meaning of the term anger has its origins in relations between people in a semiotic process, social semiotic process of other people identifying the external manifestation, giving it a word and giving it a meaning, not just a word, a meaning. That meaning that when the child appropriates that word and applies it to self, now I'm able to represent that which I experience directly. I experience it directly. Now I'm able to represent it, and bang. Now we can begin to talk of psychological knowledge, if you will, the representation of psychological processes, which does not occur either objectively or subjectively, but I hope, as I'm hoping to show, intersubjectively. This is the feeling of anger. This is what anger is. I'm feeling angry right now. Now I can even say I feel angry. The meaning of the words that name the experience arrives from the shared experience of the community of the public state. And when children internalize that language and those meanings, they're able to make their experiences intelligible. Looks like this. How do experience terms get their meaning? Look, the child scrapes his knee and goes, ah, listen to what I'm saying. Ah. And I look at it. Maybe I rub my knee. The child responds with natural reactions, crying, rubbing the area. An adult uses that expression, that public expression, to refer to the child's external and experiential state based on that public criteria. Parent says, ouch, that must have hurt. Over times and thousands of times of doing that, the child is able to represent the experience that is immediate, pain, in terms of hurt and ouch. This guy up here is crying. Wah. This one here is saying, ouch, that hurt. Ouch becomes the public manifestation, a public symbolic act that replaces the cry. Doesn't replace the cry, but it replaces the cry. The kid's still crying, but the ouch expresses what's being expressed by the cry. This hurts. And when the kid says that hurt, the kid is not pointing to the hurt for some sort of nominal purpose. The kid is not saying, hey, what I'm experiencing here is pain. Take a look. I'm labeling my experience. No, that is a public expression of pain. That hurt doesn't mean this is what we call hurt. It means help me. It means help me. I'm hurting. These knowledge of our psychological processes occurring on the intersubjective plane before they become represented on the personal plane. So the inner is not necessarily hidden. It's right there, unless we hide it. We read the child's sadness directly from her face. The assumption of the hidden interior, at least at a 100% a priori necessarily hidden interior, is a false one and a damaging one. But there's more. It's not just from the face or from the expression, the public expression, that we gain psychological knowledge. Well, we've got the mirror resonance system. We've got the neurons, mirror neurons that fire both when I see you perform an intentional action and when I perform the intentional action. So mom comes and smiles at the baby, and that causes in the baby a certain set of mirror neurons to fire. The baby smiles, and that causes similar neurons to fire. The same neurons are firing when the baby smiles as when the adult smiles. So when the adult smiles and the adult smiles, that's activating the same activity, neural activity, as when the baby smiles. And it doesn't take very far now to see that even in the actual action itself, devoid of expression, devoid of language, that we're getting a common and shared foundation, intersubjective foundation for understanding each other's experiences. When when we use language, we are referring to those not only to the public expression, but the already shared experience, intersubjective experience that has been created between us in social interaction. And that's why subjectivity fails as an explanation. We don't gain psychological knowledge by introspection, by looking into ourselves and labeling our experience, because if we did, we would never have knowledge about what the label means. We would never know that the label we're using is the same as the label you're using. We would have no public basis for identifying the quote unquote private experience. That's why subjectivity fails. Why does objectivity fail? Objectivity fails as a source of psychological knowledge, actually, for reasons that are just much more obvious, it seems to me. What does objectivity mean? It means different things to different people, so we got to be careful. The concept of objective observation, at least in psychology, you're supposed to use publicly observable behavior to record events. But what's the problem? The problem is we do not simply see what's there. We also see what's not there. We are always interpreting beyond, going beyond the information given when we are seeing somebody's behavior. We don't see configurations in the face. We see sadness. We don't see configurations of the face and the body. We see anger or guilt. That's what we experience. The subjective, quote unquote, is in the objective, quote unquote. They're saturated as part of each other. Objectivity is supposed to be unbiased. Nothing is supposed to be added or taken away from the observation. I simply describe the facts, ma'am. Of course, this is impossible. Descriptions typically require unseen psychological predicates. You'll see what I mean by that in a second. An objective observation is supposed to be one that is accurate. Accurately describes the way things really are. Well, of course, how do we figure that out if we're in an objective point of view? It's so interesting to me that when people establish objectivity, they go and they talk about validity. They talk about various forms of validity, construct validity. Well, how do we find out construct validity? Well, we pretend that what we're doing is that we compare the observation, the assessment that one person makes to the reality of the thing. Is it actually accurate? But that's not what we do. We compare the assessment of the thing with somebody else's or some other assessment of the thing that we think measures the same thing. And then we say, oh, it's valid because this way of assessing it, which is like this other way I think is similar to it to assess it. So we have validity. We're never getting at the thing. We're never getting at the thing. So let's take a look at this. We can't describe behavior by focusing only on behavior. That makes no sense. What is the baby doing? The baby's reaching for the bottle. Baby's looking at the bottle. She's reaching for the bottle. Reaching for the bottle imply agency, goal directedness, a sense that the baby is seeing the bottle. If I stand, somebody says to me, what are you doing? Describe it objectively. You can't say he stood, because that means, first of all, you got he, interesting. Stood, agency. I have some power within me that's doing the standing. And up, okay? All of these things are richly interpretive. We don't directly observe a child's goals. We have intersubjectively mediated contact with them. That's how we're able to even describe the behavior. We can't describe the behavior without the intersubjective knowledge. This observation is not a recording of simply external indicators. It is not identified without pre-understanding. It is saturated with pre-understanding. It is not a direct reflection of what is there as a result. And if it were, and it can't be, it'd be something like this. You'd have to take the baby's hand and place it in some three-dimensional space over time and see that the hand is going up here, 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 here at time and moving left to right and forward and track it in time over. Now, is that reaching? No, that's the movement of the hand. We haven't even gotten to the other stuff, right? And even if we had something like this and I showed it to you and I said, this is the movement of the baby's hand in space, you wouldn't recognize, none of us would recognize what it was because it's unintelligible, because it's psychologically unintelligible. If we wanted to be objective in this way, we would lose the psychological dimension. Here's another problem with objectivity, and I want to stress this very strongly. The problem of values in psychological inquiry, the quote unquote fact value dichotomy. Naturalistic fallacy is going from is to ought. You can't go from an is to an ought. The fact that something is a certain way doesn't mean it ought to be that way. Can't go from an is to an ought. Science is supposed to be studying what is, not what ought to be. That's the standard notion of science. Well, perhaps in the natural sciences, probably not even there. In psychological science, what we are studying is saturated with values and can't even, I argue, you can't separate the two. Maybe you can bracket them, but you can't separate the two. Not only can you not separate the two, you shouldn't. We should not. And the very fact that we think that we're supposed to be objective and carve our values out of the observation is an enormous problem. It leads us to mistake what is for what should be, because we're saying that's an objective observation. That is a socially competent act. There's no way to describe a socially competent act objectively because it's got the word competent in it. And it has already been identified in terms of some value judgment that constitutes what it is we take to be competence. Can't be done. So if you look at any of these psychological terms, authoritative parenting, social competence, self-esteem, growth mindset, moral development, gender, wisdom is one of my favorites, conversational turn, non-directive, development of math skills, formal operations, self-integration, stand up, read, any of them, all of them, has a normative, evaluative, even moral dimension to them quite often, that you cannot identify an authoritative parent independent of the values. And in fact, what happens is what we do is we misrepresent phenomena structured by values as if they were objective facts. We'll say, here's an authoritative parent. And then that becomes an objective fact to us. Then we go to China and we say, look at all these authoritative parents or these authoritarian parents. We have this notion of authoritarian parent. There it is. That's the objective thing. We go to China, we see authoritarian parents. Oh, wait a minute. Human behavior is predicated on the meaning that events have for the people involved in the culture. You can't identify a form of parenting unless you understand the meaning systems and the shared meaning systems that make that what it is. So objectivity is in many ways dangerous. We tend to think it as the common denominator. If I can only get at the objective thing, we have to agree. It's never going to happen because A, there is no simple objectivity, and B, people are always going to be, you give them the quote unquote facts. If it does not comport with their values, they're going to refute the facts as we see what's going on. So much, I suggest, of what we call theories, psychological theories and empirical observations are really kind of value systems dressed up as theories and empirical valuations, because by getting rid of the values or believing that we should get rid of the values, we fool ourselves and pretend that we're engaging in objective analysis when in fact we are engaging in human conversation about our shared experiences. We can't and shouldn't eliminate values from inquiry. Instead, we must practice radical reflexivity, figuring out how our values structure what we see and what we think. And that becomes central. So, if objectivity and subjectivity are not the sources of psychological knowledge, and note that in any introductory textbook you'll ever look at, so far as I can see, every single one of them says psychology is a science of mind and behavior. Isn't that fascinating? That the definition is of mind and behavior, or of mental processes and behavior. This dichotomy, and then we privilege the objective. It's fascinating to me. How do we fix this if this is true? If this is what's going on. Well, I would propose an intersubjective epistemology, which informs an intersubjective methodology for psychological science, for social science, maybe even for all science. If we gain psychological knowledge through our capacity for intersubjectivity, then a psychological science that is not founded on intersubjectivity will necessarily be an impoverished one. All right, so there you go. If we gain psychological knowledge through intersubjective processes, then psychology and social sciences must be intersubjective sciences, I'm suggesting to you. And if that's true, it wreaks havoc with very basic assumptions about what science is and how science ought to proceed. So, can we transcend Cartesian dichotomies? I think we can. Let's use the dialectic. We have this notion of subjectivity. We have this notion of objectivity. Well, I believe that the concept of intersubjectivity, more appropriately, interexperientiality, is a synthesis that can transcend those and solves the problem. Not in a simple way or a simple-minded way. It's complex, but it solves the problem in my view. Start with Husserl. Husserl said, when we start to observe the world, we take a naturalistic stance. The world is filled with objects. The objects exist independent of us, and we see them for what they are. This is what informs our science. However, Husserl says, observing is a form of experiencing. To observe is to experience the world, through our lenses, through our physiognomy, through our biology, through our cones and rods and meaning systems and social meaning systems. It's a form of experiencing. We live in an intersubjective life world, a world of shared meanings before we go out there and make any observation. And those shared meanings structure what we see as objects. Thus, any observation occurs through the medium of an already existing intersubjective life world, both between you and me in our interactions and within the culture as a whole. Okay, I'm going to read this to you. Forgive me, because I think it's important. What we call objective observations are not matters of recording nature as it is. They are matters of building up over time shared categories that reflect regularities in our experience of the world. However mediated that experience is by culture and scientific tools, Geiger counters, reaction times, MRIs, or what have you. What we call objectivity is a matter of creating within an already shared life world categories and meanings for everyone rather than categories and meanings for just you and me. That would be subjectivity. Terms I don't want to use. Science advances not by gaining access to an independently existing world, even though that independently existing world exists, but instead by refining distinctions in our experience and corroborating them against the mediated experiences of others in our life world. Let me try to unpack this. So, here's our everyday life, I suggest to you. Here's everyday conversation. We exist in an intersubjective world of shared and contested meanings that is called culture. Those meanings are represented and communicated through the vehicle of signs, words. Words represent socially shared meanings that have been constructed over time in the culture and are, in some sense, always quasi-arbitrary. in the sense that the meaning of any term that we have could have been otherwise under different circumstances. That's science, it's words. It's the tool of culture, the vehicle of culture, the vehicle of higher order communication. When we interact, I act and I express in my actions, in my emotional expressions, in my words. You do the same. Through our mirror neuron system, through our capacity to understand words, we're able to engage in intersubjective interactions with each other. We gain knowledge of our own psychological processes through the application of signs in reflection. That's what we call introspection. Introspection is not introspection, it is reflection on experience. What we do is we take signs and we're able to use them to parse our experience. And that's where we get into psychological knowledge. Our psychological knowledge comes from our capacity to reflect on our psychological states through intersubjective mediums that have been created between people over time and within cultures. That's everyday life. Science, psychological science, social science, I suggest, is simply a refinement of this. Einstein said the entirety of science is a refinement of everyday thinking. There's your everyday thinking. When we engage in psychological science, we simply take this and we apply it, we extend it to the world of humans that we are examining. So that if I'm looking at if I want to figure out what anger is all about, I look at you, I look at the expression that you have. I assume that is an expression of your experience because it's already in my language and my experience. And I build a theory of anger. And when I do that, well, I can't do that myself. I'm doing it with you. And we're corroborating across our meaning systems and across our experiences in order to form a corroborated theory of anger or whatever it is that I'm talking about. So that what science is or should be is an extension of our everyday practice. Now, note when we do that, I mean everything that is in our intersubjectivity. The quote unquote public behavior, the representation of experience, the value presuppositions that we have. We bring all of this to our understanding of the world. Ekman, how did he come up with his theories of facial expression? Take a look at his book, Telling Lies, I think it is. Well, what he did is he looked at facial expressions. And he looked at them for a long time and he was talking with other people about it. What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? What is that little thing up there? Oh my God. There's a little flip of the lip there. What's that? Oh, that's contempt. How do you know that's a contempt? It makes me feel it's an entirely intersubjective throwing oneself into and being thrown into the experience. We get our understanding of the facial expression not from the darn muscle movements, although he was able to point to them, but from the intersubjective experience. The emotion is called anger because of its relation to the expression, not the other way around. So instead of theory is one thing, observation is another, which is what happens in the standard story of science. We have theories that are tested by independent observations. No, we have observation is structured by intersubjective and value-laden pre-understandings that are modified hermeneutically as they are applied to the task of describing and explaining the socio-psychological world. That would be an intersubjective conception of social science. Here's the one we have now, the post-positive one. Post-positivism adds the paradigmatic level here, but in positivism, we have a theory, and then the theory generates operational definitions, and then we have a big line between the hypothetical and the observational world. We test the hypothesis, which is in operationally objective terms, against observable behavior, which then support or don't support the hypothesis, which either supports or don't support the theory. We concede that these theories are embedded in assumptions, beliefs, values, and paradigms, But these are still, there's a line between that and the theory as well. Here's where real science takes place. A intersubjective social science would look, in my opinion, very different, but can be as rigorous, and I suggest even more rigorous than the positive side. The positivist science appears to be rigorous, but isn't. This would be more rigorous. You start and acknowledge that all of my knowledge of psychological processes comes from my everyday intersubjectivity. I interact with my people in caregiving. They give me words. I reflect upon my own experience. I reflect on your experience. And then I come up with questions. Hey, why is it that people feel jealous? Well, my intuition, coming back to my everydayness, my intuition says that people are jealous when somebody else has something that they want. My everyday that I'm jealous when you've got something that I want, and I want it, and I want it. I'm jealous of you. Not enough. What happens in positivist science, we go with that and we go immediately to the hypothesis or the theory. Now we come up with some theory based upon our beliefs. And we think that the data are going to tell us what the definition is. Never going to happen. So now I've got my theory of jealousy. And now I got to go to the literature. What literature? No, not just the psychological literature, the philosophical literature, the humanistic literature, the conceptual literature. Wittgenstein, again, has talked about philosophy as being a source of conceptual clarification. I need to clarify my thinking. And when I go in there and I look for a definition of jealousy in the philosophical literature, I find out I'm wrong. Oh my God, I'm describing what people call envy. That's not what jealousy is. Jealousy is a triad, at least according to the philosophers. Jealousy is when you have she loves him more than she loves me. It's a triad. Envy is something completely different. My intuition was wrong, and so I'm going to do all types of conceptual, philosophical clarification before I construct my theory, because the answer to what these concepts means is not to be found in the data the way psychologists think it is, and the way that they irresponsibly so often simply put their intuitions into a survey and then survey people thinking that that's some sort of an objective thing when it really is a kind of a internal conceptual loop. You get your constructed theory then. What's my theory of jealousy? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mediate. I'm going to study somebody. But when I study somebody, I have to understand this is always a form, any assessment is always a form of mediated intersubjectivity. It is not an objective accounting or recording of the way things are. No, it's filtered through the question that I've come up with, my theory that I'm constantly going to be reflexive about. And when I come up with my survey, if that's it, that's one mediated source. If I come up with observations, that's another mediated source. If I come up with focus groups, that's another mediated source. And that mediated intersubjectivity creates data. And that data are derived and mediated, never objective. But when I get the derived data and I compare it against my theory, my theory is going to be wrong. In the sense of it's almost always going to have some discrepancy in it, like the hermeneutic circle. And then I engage in revision and interpretation of the theory. But I'm never independent. It is always intersubjective. It is always informed by values. And with a process like this, it exposes, I suggest, rather than hides. Because objectivity is a kind of in my view, a kind of a macho hiding. I hide from the soft underbelly of how knowledge is constructed. But this gives you no place to hide. That what constitutes truth statements, this is probably the biggest thing I'm going to say. What constitutes truth statements? Truth statements are not to be found in the correspondence between theory and data, because the data are always derived. But truth statements can be found in a more rigorous process through the pattern of corroboration amongst all these steps. the pattern of corroboration, that when I say my experience of jealousy is this, I think that person's feeling jealous because of the things they said and the things that they didn't say and how it makes me feel. And here's the concept that we're using. And you say, well, it's a little different. We've got to corroborate all of those things, and that it becomes important to say, instead of this is a truth or this hypothesis is verified by objective data. Instead, we say, I suggest, this hypothesis is corroborated. This hypothesis is highly corroborated by mediated intersubjective data. It does not get us at the truth. However, it is not relativistic. In no way is it relativistic. In a way, it's more powerful because it says, if you make a claim, you better figure out how it relates to all the other claims, and you better have that worked out. Because if there's even one claim that's inconsistent, you got to figure that out. And so that there's multiple constraints coming from multiple places, what people call intersubjectivity. Multiple places, multiple constraints from multiple places that constrain my truth statement. And I have to continually be open to revising it in terms of that. And I cannot escape either epistemologically or morally by referring to some objective world.